Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for this webinar on Founder's Guide to Setting Up a Data Analytics Foundation. My name is Priyanka, and I work as an event marketing specialist at Hivo. I will be your host and moderator for this webinar. Before we start today's session, I would like to remind you of a few things. All attendees will be on listen-only mode. You can type in your questions anytime during the webinar in the Q&A window that's available, and we will address them at the end of the session. So I'm sure most of you already know about Hero, but we have a lot of new attendees today, so I will just give you a quick overview. Hivo is a no-code data pipeline platform that connects and loads your data that's lying across multiple source systems into a data warehouse of your choice, such as Redshift, BigQuery, Snowflake, and others. Hivo provides pre-built integrations with over 100 different data sources and also supports advanced data transformation. Hivo is currently used by thousands of data enthusiasts who are working across multiple verticals and who are based out of over 40 different countries. For more information, you can visit our website, www.hivodata.com. I will now introduce you to our speaker for today's session. Jennifer Stirrup is the founder and CEO of Data Relish, a UK-based AI and business intelligence leadership boutique consultancy, delivering data strategy and business-focused solutions. Jennifer is a recognized leading authority in AI and business intelligence leadership, a Fortune 100 global speaker, and has been named as one of the top 50 global data visionaries, one of the top data scientists to follow on Twitter, and one of the most influential top 50 women in technology worldwide. Jen has clients in 24 countries, in 5 continents, and holds a postgraduate degree in AI and cognitive science. Jen is a #1 Amazon best-selling author who has authored books on organizational change, data, and artificial intelligence. Jennifer has been featured on CBS Interactive and the BBC, as well as other well-known podcasts. So let's begin the sessions, Jennifer. I'm so glad you're here. Thank you so much for joining us and for participating as a speaker.
Thank you, Priyanka, and thank you also to Hivo Data for generously hosting the session today. So with that, if you don't mind, could I please share my slide deck?
Yes, you'll be able to share it. And yes, thanks to all the attendees for joining us here today. Thank you all.
Thank you so much, and thank you for that great introduction, and thank you to everybody who has attended today. I hope you find this session valuable. So what we're going to do is we are going to look at the most valuable asset in any organization, which is your data. So Priyanka has already explained to you about some of the data pipeline technology that's available. It's really important to make the most of our data by making it as rich as possible and cleaning it and getting it into a good shape. Good data allows us to set up baselines, benchmarks, and goals in order to keep our organization moving forward in the right direction. But to benefit from that data, we really need a strong data foundation, and that needs to be established before the organization can move forward. So in this session, we'll look at the importance of a data foundation. I'll give you some ideas about data metrics that you may want to track. We'll look at the building blocks of a good data foundation and how to make that data foundation stronger. So as Priyanka already mentioned, my name is Jen Stirrup, and feel free to connect with me online. We've got a number of items that I'd like to share with you today. We want to look at what a good data foundation actually looks like. We want to look at different ways that we can understand what data you have already and what data you might actually need in order to strengthen your data foundation. To do that, we'll look at some of the building blocks of your data foundation, how to strengthen it, and the sort of problems that you may want to try to solve when looking at your data foundation. So what is it you're trying to achieve? Well, without a solid data foundation as part of a holistic approach when you're looking at businesses, organizations will struggle to understand where they're successful, and they'll also struggle to understand how they could improve as well. So let me tell you, good business intelligence is based on a solid data foundation. Machine intelligence, machine learning, is based on a solid data foundation. Artificial intelligence is based on a solid data foundation. Augmented intelligence, the future of decision making, also requires a solid foundation. In case you're not familiar with the term, augmented intelligence is the blending of AI with human judgment, and it's also based on that all-important data foundation. So you can't have these exciting buzzwords unless you have a good solid foundation to spring forward from. So with that in mind, what is it we're trying to achieve? Overall, a good data foundation is critical, is the basis for all types of reporting and analytics. Understanding who your customers are, for example, and how you can serve your customers better. So overall, a good data foundation is critical as the basis for all types of reporting and analytics. This data is essentially helping to lead you towards wisdom. It's helping you to have a continuous transformation process and good opportunities for the organization. A really good business-oriented data strategy will help you to drive better decisions and return on investment. It will also help you to have raw data and to go from raw data through to wisdom that will help inform actions. For example, do you know who your most important customer actually is? It's easy to get very confused by data sometimes, particularly if you don't know where the data is and you find it hard to discover it and to search what you're looking for when you need it. We're also looking at consistent answers, leading to a consistent understanding across the business as well. It also gives us a good competitive advantage because good data growth will ultimately lead us to better strategies. And we can start to measure those when we think about our good data performance. I mentioned KPIs earlier. A KPI will help you to understand if you have a good data strategy in place or not. But first of all, what is a KPI? Well, a KPI is a key performance indicator. It's a quantifiable measure used to evaluate the success of a measurement entity in meeting its objectives as a business. Now, the KPI could cover the entire enterprise, such as a sales turnover, or it could impact a business department as well, such as a team or maybe a product category. It's helping to understand where your business sits right now and how far away you are from those targets. For example, your sales targets. So the solid data foundation is helping you to understand your business together and better. It gives everyone a common canvas in the organization to help support you when you're all together as a team, whether that's a small team or a larger enterprise. So you all have a common understanding of the goals and the metrics, the measurements in the organisation. A key performance indicator is a reflection of the overall strategic objectives in driving and pushing those business results. If you're using a KPI to measure performance, then that really helps to drive the behaviour and the culture towards meeting the objectives of the organisation. Now, we talk about what gets measured gets done. It's a bit of a way of looking at data, and the phrase comes from Peter Drucker. He's a management luminary. His writings are still very powerful, even though we have been in the industry for a long time. And what he really talks about is how what gets measured gets managed. But if you read his writing, it's actually a bit more subtle than that. What he says is, you measure things that you care about. Now let's think about that, because it's quite subtle actually. It's not as simple as saying what gets measured gets managed. If you actually read his texts, he says that, but he goes on to say, businesses care about certain things, and those things are what get measured. And that helps to drive the business performance towards those measurements. So the KPIs in particular are all about trying to drive business behaviour, but also we're demonstrating across the organisation what you actually care about. So what can you do to build that robust KPI framework to help drive the business from data to insights and actions, and also ethics as well? So the first thing you want to think about really is robust insights. We sometimes find it easy just to say, well, let's measure everything, because we don't know what to measure. Now, just to quote Albert Einstein once said, not everything that can be counted actually counts. So what we want to know is what counts to our business and why. We also want to think about accountability. Who's responsible for the metrics and the measurements? Who overall is accountable for trying to understand the business and explaining and identifying what those metrics actually are? So that means by identifying who is accountable, that the business has got clear expectations from the individual on how to achieve the goals as agreed across the organisation. That helps us to identify if there's a difference between expected performance and actual performance as well. Now, we do know that business data is often quite messy. Priyanka just mentioned Evo data analytics and what you're doing there. And the thing is, in order to try to cure some of these data problems that people see, you need a really good, robust system in place of trying to clean the data. And that's why data pipelines are so important. You can't just build them and then forget about it. It's a process of continuous transformation as well. So continuous transformation is bigger in some ways than digital transformation. With continuous transformation, we are starting to think about what does that actually look like for the business. We're not just saying that we've now performed and we have now completed a process of digital transformation, tick the box, we're done now. If only life was that simple. But that's not how it works actually. When we are looking at continuous transformation, we're constantly looking at how can we optimize and improve the organisation in so many different ways. How can we make things better? And how can we make everything a much more appealing for the organisation to try and to follow as well? So continuous transformation is all about trying to optimize. But you can only do that if you have a good grapple of what the data is actually saying. If your data isn't very good, then you've probably got symptoms of a bad or a problematic data foundation. Now, that's the suboptimal business decisions, and the sum of all those suboptimal business decisions due to incorrect data and information as well. That introduces a risk to the organisation. It does that because if you can't identify the data, say for example it's personally identifiable data, if you're not looking after it properly, that could produce an increased risk for the organisation. We see countries all over the world implementing better protection for citizens and their data. So it's also, if we are not very solid in terms of the data foundation, it can reduce productivity. And the way it does that is because people can find the information that they need really quickly. That's usually a result of ineffective processes. And it also indicates that the organisation itself is not very adaptable. We know from Charles Darwin that adaptability is a key element of survival. So we're trying to think about ways that we can remain adaptable as well. So productivity is a crucial point as well. It's about finding the data that we need at the point when we actually need it. So how does that impact a key performance indicator when we're thinking about entrepreneurship, being an entrepreneur or a company founder, and how that impacts data analytics? So let's have a think about what you should measure. Well, what key metrics tell you that your business is healthy? Well, you can look at things like sales turnover, for example. How do you know if your sales department had a good week or a good month? What problem is it your business is trying to solve? Are you managing to help customers, for example, to save money? Are you reducing costs? If so, can you identify how much cost you have saved your customers for the past week or the past month, for example? How do you know when success is happening in the organisation? So that really means that the KPIs should be easy to understand whether they are successful or not. So let's have a think about how we can emphasise productivity and KPIs as well. How can we try and make sure we can measure the business effectively? A crucial point is consistency. How can we measure the business consistently over a long period of time? It's important to take a baseline, and we take baselines so that we can show improvement over time. So what does that mean for, say, the human resources department? You could measure things like employee churn rate. You could also look at the amount of revenue per employee as well that's been generated. You can also look at things like employee net promoter score. Would you recommend this company to your friends? And so that's the sort of employee metric. You'll probably find most people will say yes, they don't want to get into trouble with their employers. But employee satisfaction can be notoriously difficult to try and measure truthfully. So that's why we start to look at things like employee churn rate, because we can identify if people keep leaving, then there must be an issue. We also need to understand how we can consistently measure what our customers actually look like. This gives us a competitive advantage. We, for example, could look at things like a customer net promoter score. That's the delight index. Would customers recommend you? Would they recommend you to their friends? And would they purchase a service or a product from you again? Do you know who your most valuable customer is? So that tells you how the customer is doing from your perspective. Do you know what the customer voice actually is? So for example, do you have a customer health index? Do they recommend you to other companies, for example? What's the customer retention rate like as well? These are all fantastic key performance indicators. You can measure if you have got repeat customers. And you can also measure customer satisfaction as well. It's more easy now to do surveys than it used to be. So we can use things like Google Forms, for example, or Microsoft Forms. Another way you can measure competitive advantage is to think about things like your shareholder KPIs. What's the price divided by the share? How many months cash runway has your business got? That's really important if you're founding or just started a startup. How many months cash do you have in the bank? And also, how much turnover do you have as well? So we can also think about it quite easily. We can go back, for example, to think about productivity again. I want to talk about this again because you can implement some key performance indicators here that will help you to measure productivity in your business as well. For example, if you were shipping a software product, you could account for the quality of your service. For example, how many bugs did you find in your software? Just as an example. You could also look at it from the other perspective as well, such as the supply chain. How many mistakes were made through the supply chain that landed in your organization? Now, we can often expect there will be some spoil when we get goods and services delivered to us. It's not always 100%. So you could keep a track of supplier mistakes. And if the supplier keeps making mistakes, then you can think about, do you think about switching suppliers, for example? You can also think about productivity in terms of the supply chain, and that really means on-time delivery. How often did your suppliers deliver to you on time? So all of these metrics together could roll up to create a supply chain efficiency key metric, key performance indicator. So productivity and process can really help you when you are thinking about identifying metrics for supporting your particular business and tracking the success of that. So just to revisit competitive advantage again, I want to call out some specific sales key performance indicators that might help you as a small business founder in order to help support you as you grow your business. Now, we can look at the actual sales versus the target sales. We can also look at annual turnover as well. We can also look at the number of new qualified leads that you have in place. We can also think about the opportunity to win ratio. So how many opportunities did you have, and how many of those opportunities did you actually win? So there's all sorts of different ways you can think about competitive advantage and what that actually looks like. One obvious thing to think about is finance KPIs. In some ways, they are the easiest thing in order to collect because everyone has a ledger, everyone has a sales system. So there's some fairly obvious ones with their balance sheets as well. So with that, you could think about net profit would be one metric to watch over time. We could also think about revenue growth rate as well. How fast are you growing the revenue in your organization? We can also think about profit margin as well. I'd also have a look at things like shareholder value. So if an organization has got a negative shareholder value, that really means that the organization could be in trouble. So that's something you want to look out for. Now, it depends on the business. If you are running a fast food chain, for example, then actually you may find sometimes you have a negative shareholder equity. And the reason for that is you've had to buy a lot of food which you have not sold yet. So you tend to see that happening in services and areas like that. But if you're a consulting firm and you are operating with a negative shareholder equity, then that would be unexpected and that would raise eyebrows. So these are the sort of metrics which a business is looking at when they are, say an investor is looking at your business, they might be looking at these things. So if I were you, I'd suggest looking at the key performance indicators for finance as well, such as accounts receivable. So the number of days accounts receivable occurs in. Net profit is a good one as well. I'd also have a look at the revenue growth rate, and I'd have a look at whether or not it's negative shareholder value and if that is appropriate for the type of business that they are in as well. So there's lots of good KPIs here. Not all of these will be relevant to your particular organisation, but what we are doing is giving you some suggestions in the ways that you can track and measure the success of your business to help you to become data-driven and insights-inspired when you are moving towards thinking about how to measure your business. So understanding the data that you need is actually really important. Now, I don't often see businesses that have data dictionaries. So if your company has one, that's great. If you don't have one, then you may think about building out a data dictionary so you can understand the overall architecture as well as the low-level detail in the business as well. So what does it actually mean to understand the data? There's a number of ways that you can measure the quality of data. One is certainty. How certain are you that your data is correct? What's your measure of confidence in that data? So that metric of certainty can actually come from a number of different places. And I'll give you some examples of some more key performance indicators that will help you to think about the data in your business and how you might measure that data looking at data quality. Again, we're thinking about a strong data foundation. And having that strong data foundation will depend on having your data in a good shape. So, for example, when we think about certainty, you could start off looking at the certainty measure of your customer data. So you could ask your team how many changes did they need to make to customer data within the last week, the last month, last quarter, or the last year, just as an example. So you could use a percentage metric. How many customers needed changes divided by the total number of customers. So you could track that percentage of certainty throughout the organisation, and you could also slice and dice it by time as well. You could also look at it in terms of the number of people making changes to the data. So, for example, you could take the total number of employees who did not need to make changes to the data and divide that by the total number of relevant employees. And you can measure that over time. And hopefully, as the data quality starts to increase, you'll find that the total number of employees who didn't need to make changes to the data will hopefully increase over time as a percentage. Another metric you may also want to look at is how many customer records did you have to approve as a manager or as a business leader. So if you had to approve a lot of changes to lots of customer records, then that's clearly a drain on your time and also a drain in your productivity as well. So over time, you're hoping that the overall percentage of customer records that you have to approve will decrease over time, because you don't have, if your data is clean, then you probably don't need to approve as many changes as before, because no changes need to be made because the data is actually correct. So understanding the data you need is partly about having confidence in your clean data as well. We can also think about coverage as well. So we're thinking about coverage in terms of, are you certain that the data actually covers what you need? So that's allowing you to see what data are you not able to collect right now that you would like to be able to collect. So to do that, you might look at the total number of employees who were not required to look for data because they found it easily and it was being stored, divided by the total number of relevant employees. So the building blocks of data cover things like certainty. How certain are you that your data is correct? And then we can look at the coverage as well. Now that's related to completeness. How complete is your data set? Are you missing data? So you could look at how many nulls you have, how many blank records you have. All of these things can go towards a completeness metric, and that's another key performance indicator that helps provide a building block for your data foundation. So if you find that your data pipelines are moving lots of data that's essentially blank, the data pipeline could populate the empty records with some data. Now that could be the median, for example, and it could also be the mean. Sometimes when I'm replacing missing data, which is incomplete, I'm actually replacing it with the median rather than the mean, because the median is less sensitive to outliers. So there's that. We've also got currency as well. So how current is that data? Is it out of date, for example? We've also got commonality as well. Do you find that in your systems, you have got the same types of data being stored in different systems? One of my customers, who will remain nameless, actually had 8 different customer relationship management systems. Can you believe that they actually had 8 of them? The only reason I found out that they had 8 CRM systems is because I was in an in-person meeting with their CIO, their Chief Information Officer, and someone knocked on the door to ask for sign-off for a 9th customer relationship system. They said that the 9th system had some functionality which the other 8 did not. Now, the Chief Information Officer nearly threw this person out of the office for requesting a 9th CRM system. They were quite directly told that they already had 8 systems, and that was way too many, because they were having to duplicate all of that data every time a change was made. So we're looking at completeness and trying to understand how we can measure customer data consistently and how current the data is. Because if you've got 8 CRM systems and one is more up to date than the others, then the other system need to be updated too at some point in the day. So that really means that we have got a measure of how current our systems actually are. We're also thinking about things like commonality, and say, for example, the situation with 8 systems, how much overlap is there between all of the different systems? So we're thinking about, how do we make that data foundation stronger? So we're trying to think of different ways we can make it stronger. One is to understand the data that you've actually collected. So sales data, customer contact information, website traffic statistics. And that could involve everything from basic descriptive statistics right through to advanced analytics. Businesses actually accumulate a lot of data. The problem is not capturing data, accessing lots of data. The problem is how to make that data intelligent and interesting. And that's where we're trying to build pipelines of data to move the data around so we can make it richer and make it easier to understand the voice of the customer. So what kind of data do we actually need? Well, what to do is think about some of the customer questions that you actually have in place. For example, if your company does specific marketing campaigns, how do you know if those have been successful? For example, could you compare a before and then an after? You can't do that unless you are keeping a track of the data and storing it and able to compare it as well. How would you get in touch with your most valuable customers who regularly buy from your company? It's actually more complex than you might think in order to unpick that question. When you try to understand who's your most valuable customer, that interpretation may be different depending on who you speak to in the organization. For example, for some, the most valuable customer may simply be the person who buys from you most frequently, or the person who has the largest that you receive the largest turnover from. But the thing is, you could also have other customers as well who don't buy as much from you, but they are using the social media influence to help sell your services. We know that influencer marketing is becoming increasingly important. We also need to think about making the data foundation stronger by working out what is useful to one department and what's useful to the whole organization horizontally. So you find that there's a very wide-ranging amounts of data across the organization when we start to look at business data. So understanding the data that you need will really help you to see how you can make your data much more accessible to everybody. We also want to think about risks to the organization. What happens when things go wrong? So far, we've talked about KPIs. We've talked about the happy path. What happens when things start to go well? So with that in mind, we need to think about the sad path as well. What happens if something is going wrong? So we need to evaluate risks to the organization as well. People say often you're only as good as your last backup. I'm not sure that's true. I think you're only as good as your last restore point. Now, businesses can back up the data, but they don't always check out whether the restore actually works or not. So I recommend that you start to think about that. I mentioned earlier personally identifiable information. We know that some organizations are not always very careful when they are looking after people's data. And I'll give you an example. We thought about the UK Ministry of Justice recently, very embarrassingly, were not answering requests quickly enough for organizations, for people that were asking for their data. So it's not just rogue small businesses that are not always careful with the data. It's actually lots of people are not careful with the data, and that can even include government bodies as well. So we're thinking about risks to the organization when we're thinking about data as well. So we have to prepare for those emergencies. Someone asked me recently, how often do you actually do things like pen testing? So I was able to give some examples based on customer experience. But some organizations don't seem to do any sort of practicing at all for processes in place if there's a security breach or a data breach with their data. So there's lots of different ways we can start to prepare for emergencies as well. So we can think about it in terms of what happens with the data and where's it likely to go. Keep practicing data breaches as well, and know who you need to report these things to. And you can have people in the organisation who are responsible for the stewardship of that data as well. So I'd recommend that you start to think about who's the overall accountable and responsible person for the data in the organisation. They should have a good crisis response plan, a baseline to show improvement over time as things start to get better. Also, a key important point is about data integration as well. We want to think about the organisation and how data flows between different departments. Data tends to flow horizontally across the business as well as vertically as well. When we think of businesses, we tend to think of the sales data, the marketing data, the operations data, that kind of thing. But we also need to think about a baseline to show improvement as well, and data integration. How does the data integrate across the organisation? How do different departments impact one another when they're thinking about and working with their data? I've mentioned some data quality examples before. So looking at things like certainty, currency, thinking about the choice as well, and the way that people are handling that data. Because ultimately, communicating consistently across the organisation is such an important key factor when we are thinking about trying to understand exactly what the organisation is measuring. We need a clear understanding of what the company is doing, what it's measuring. Otherwise, it's very difficult to make effective business decisions for the long term. So that's why key performance indicators are really important. They offer us insights, they offer visibility, and they can help us with communication across the organisation as well. It allows us to think about visibility, and that visibility across the organisation is what really helps us to think about business value as well. So there's plenty of things that we can do to try and make the organisation more successful when we are thinking about our data summaries. So I want to just go through some more KPIs first that hopefully you'll find interesting. We're going to move on to the summary. What I'd like to do is just give you a little nudge if anyone has any questions. We will be opening the floor up shortly for anyone who's got any specific questions. Remember, myself and Priyanka, we're here to help. So please feel free to start thinking about what questions you'd like to ask, and I look forward to taking those shortly. So what KPIs, key performance indicators, can help you in your organisation to go from a startup to a scale-up and to think about having a really successful data foundation if you are an entrepreneur or a founder as well. Excuse me. Sorry. Excuse me. I apologise. So one thing to think about is about starting with the data strategy. That is everyone being clear in what the business is trying to achieve. Now, it's not always simple as saying, well, they want to make money, right? Not always. Sometimes it's phrased as wanting to lift up other people by offering them a product or a service that will ultimately have a good impact for that customer. It's often easy to come up with a huge list of key performance indicators that you feel that you should measure. But often companies will create a huge strategy document that no one will ever read or even understand, and make everything as simple as possible. It's very easy for companies to sit and fiddle around with numbers and not really make decisions, but feel like they're doing some actual work. What you're trying to do is link KPIs to your strategy. That will help you to focus better on what it is you'd like to measure. So to do that, don't just think about the key performance indicators, but think about the key performance questions as well. That will help you to identify what data you'd like to grab and which KPIs will actually add real value to your business. So you may want to ask yourself very simple questions such as, which department is making the most profit and which processes are costing us the most amount of money? Now, if you are not fully digital, you may still be accessing checks. You may be sending checks, you may be receiving checks. That's just one example where you might think, well, actually that process costs us a lot of money. How can I encourage our customers to stop sending checks and sign up using direct debit or use a banking service? We also think about our data needs as well. So that's about thinking about data quality. So how certain are you your data is correct? Is there any overlap between different systems? Is there any way you can start to streamline those? And you can evaluate your existing data and start to think about cleaning it and using data pipelines to help and support you to do that. And make sure you are storing the right data that will help to support that overall business vision. You might find the data you're looking at is not actually the data that you really need. That will help you to make better sense of the world of data that you have and help you to make better business decisions as well. So what we've got as well is assigning ownership for those KPIs. So thinking about who's responsible and accountable for data collection and who is responsible for making sure that data quality is maintained across the organisation as well. It's also about thinking about communicating that message as well, which KPIs are understood best by the people in the organisation, and trying to make sure there's an ongoing review process as well, so that people understand the performance better and make better decisions to improve business performance. Otherwise, if we don't do that, simply everything is becoming straightforward noise. So with that in mind, I'm just going to have a look through some of the questions. I can see some questions starting to come in, so thank you very much for those. So I'm just going to have a look through. So I'm just going to answer this one live. Thank you, Philip, for your question. You're going to set up an analytics team for a combined fintech company, a budget for 5 full-time people. Which roles would you distinguish for a solid data foundation? I think I would be interested to understand the data engineering aspect. So sometimes data engineering is all about cleaning the data, the person who might make pipelines to push the data and make sure data quality is a good foundation for supporting the data in the business. So a data engineer is somebody who's experienced usually in data pipelines, manages to clean data as they go along. They probably spend a lot of their time in PTL, so extract, transform and load pipelines, or perhaps CLT, extract, transform and then load. So there's lots of different data engineering types of roles. I'd also say that personally, I think there's a role for a data translator in the business. It doesn't have to be a person, it can be a role that different people adopt at different times. Soft skills is one of the most important things in any data-based organisation. People don't always understand the data, and we have to take that data and translate it so that the business people can understand it better and make better decisions on that data. So if you're speaking to a business person and you say, well, this is what the data looks like with a probability of 0.05, and we could do some regression on that, and see the metrics that come up there. So if you start talking even very basic data science to them, they may not always understand that. So I think a data translator is a really important role. Who's going to build stories with that data to make it impactful and help people to understand better the voice of the customer in that data? So a data translator is maybe not a role that people come across very much, but I think that's actually really important as well. I also like the idea of a data steward, somebody who looks after things like a data dictionary, a data glossary, like a business glossary. One team that I was leading, I had a very junior data scientist join the organisation. She was on a trainee graduate scheme. She didn't have a maths background, and she just wanted to get started in the world of data science. And what I did with her was I asked her to build a data dictionary of all the systems that we were going to touch as part of the wider projects. And I said, you'll be doing that for your first 3 months. Now, I'm sure she absolutely hated me for that, because building a data dictionary is not always fun. But the value of the completed data dictionary was invaluable to the organisational progress, because nobody at that point really understood what the data looked like, where it was stored, and didn't understand the meaning of it either. So by the end of the 3 months, she actually said to me, I'm actually really grateful that you made me do that. She wasn't happy at first, and I knew that, but because she wanted to go in and start coding straight away. But what that did was it gave her the opportunity to meet lots of people in the organisation and to go and extract as much information about the data as possible from everyone in the organisation. Lots of organisations want to build a data dictionary, not that many people do it. And that told the organisation a lot about processes. It also helped to uncover where the data quality was poor. For example, if a system had an empty column in it, we needed to understand why. We could also better identify if the data was being stored in one column in some circumstances and in other circumstances being stored somewhere else completely differently. So I would suggest, really, to summarise and answer your question, Philip, I would say a data translator would be important. Get someone who can understand the data and turn that into something the business leaders can understand. I would say a data engineer to help build those pipelines. I'd also suggest a data scientist is someone who does very complex algorithms. So you probably have one of those, but I'd also suggest having a junior data scientist on board as well. That can be useful. They can help to draw the horizontal lines and connections between the different departments in the organisation, simply by doing things like creating a data dictionary. I also think that having a very savvy data analyst, stroke business analyst, with strong data skills is also important in organisations as well. I think personally the most successful organisations I see are the ones that have got a strong business analysis programme. The reason for that is they can help you to identify where to cut costs. They can also help you make decisions about the business as well. So if you want to package up the business analysis output into work packages, you can decide whether to outsource some of those work packages, keep them internally, hire freelancers and contractors, consultants to do that. So I think having a business and data savvy business analyst or data analyst is actually a really important role as well. So hopefully that helps. I'm going to summarize: data translator, data scientist, you're in fintech, so get them to understand and build algorithms. A junior data scientist can help hold all the threads together. They can also help to test the work done by the data scientist, and that means they get onboarded as well. And I think a data analyst is a good idea as well. and a data engineer. I think I've mentioned 5. So hopefully that helps a little bit to answer that question. But I think those 5 things together, those 5 roles, would help to orchestrate a good data foundation. So well, that's okay. So I'm just checking to see if there's any other questions. Oh, I see Priyanka is back. Hello, Priyanka. And I'm just double checking to see if there's any other questions. Let me know when you want to wrap up, but I'm here and ready in case anyone's got any more questions.
It would be great if the audience could type in your questions. This was a very great session, and I'm sure you had a lot to take away from. So, if you have any questions for Jennifer, we probably give it a couple of more seconds, and then we'll just see if we have some.
Yeah, so don't be shy. There's plenty to talk about, I'm sure. And I think particularly with respect to the data engineering role, this is maybe a subject quite close to your heart, Priyanka, but having those reliable data pipelines is something that's really crucial to a really sound data foundation.
Yes.
If you haven't got reliable data pipelines, I'd honestly say you don't have a solid data foundation. It's something that's really crucial. And because what I think is really up and coming trend in the industry is no code. I think that's a great way for businesses to get started in a data foundation as well, because it's a very quick way for people to get started. It's very intuitive. It's something businesses can start to pick up, and it allows people to derive value from their data really quickly. Something we talk about in the industry is called the data dividend. And what the data dividend is all about trying to get value from the data as quickly as possible. And using things like really reliable data pipelines can help businesses to reach that data dividend as quickly as possible. And that's where you are getting good responses from your analytics really as quickly as possible. And to do that, it's really helpful to ingest data from all different types of sources. I mentioned earlier a few different data sources, so you can take those from your internal applications like your own databases. You can also use them from other technologies as well. If you don't mind, I can mention things like HubSpot and MailChimp. They're really great for small organizations as well to get up and running really quickly as possible. So, and the idea is really about being able to scale as well. I think that's a really important point for that foundation, being able to build up and build out to scale. So I see another question from Philip, so I'm just going to read it. So do you see a low-code approach in data pipelines in large organizations or in smaller companies? I actually see them in small and large companies. I think I'm seeing no-code and low-code solutions becoming increasingly adopted as the business is starting to understand that they can actually have the opportunity to build out data pipelines in particular as quickly and easily as possible. I think the industry is really crying out for quick solutions for people to get value from their data as quickly as possible. So I'm seeing this more in large organizations as well as small ones. With large organizations, they often have what you might call heritage systems, legacy systems. They're not coming at this fresh. They've probably got a lot of old systems. Some large organizations I've worked with have actually got themselves into the situation where they build a new system to replace an old system, and then they don't switch the old system off. So they end up with 2 systems where they only had one. And they're updating both of those systems, the old one and the new one. So large organizations can sometimes be inflexible. And I think looking at no-code solutions in particular is helping them to become more flexible, because they don't have the luxury of smaller startups. They're coming at data problems with a legacy and a heritage of older systems, which often need replaced and rebuilt and rebranded really for today's analytical environment. I've dealt with mainframes, which are, a couple of decades old. People are trying to move away from them. And suddenly it's like, the way I look at it is as if they're seeing a colour television for the first time, right? So I remember when I was growing up, we used to just have black and white televisions, right? So, but then as I got older, suddenly colour televisions were everywhere. And it was like an amazing thing, was having a colour television. And I think the analytics industry is starting to grapple and understand the benefits of things like low code and no code and data pipelines. And for them, it's like seeing a colour television for the first time. It's helping them to get value really, really quickly. So I hope that's answered your question. But yes, I'm seeing no code becoming a real movement in data and in programming as well. So things like Bubble, for example, for using with website creation. So I see Priyanka's back. Priyanka, did you have any other questions or comments?
No, I think these are the only questions we've got, and we're also running out of time, Jennifer, so we'll have to wrap up. But this was a great session. Thank you so much for putting together such a great presentation and for sharing your insights, for your time and participating as a speaker, and for sharing, your knowledge with the audience. Thank you so much, Jennifer.
Thank you very much. I hope everybody has a wonderful day or evening wherever you are in the world. And thank you so much for your time. I appreciate it.